Yo, what's up everybody? It's David Brodeur AKA Brilly, and today what we're going to do is we're going to focus on increasing and speeding up our render times in Octane. How do we optimize our render settings? So we're just going to jump into it here today. Let's open up our Octane settings here, and a couple of things that we're going to focus on is the first thing is we're going to be using the kernel path tracing here. And let's start looking at some basic stuff. So first, let's look at the actual max sample count. This is going to be the first thing and probably one of the most important things to adjust. By default, it's at 16,000 samples. That is insane. I've never had to use that many samples in any render I've ever done. That's not to say that that's going to be the same for you, but it's extremely, extremely high. So what's the right sample count? Well, there's no real set number that I can give you or anyone can give you and say, hey, just give this many samples and your image is always going to be perfect. And so the idea is that it all is going to change every scene that you make. Lighting, materials, all that stuff, scene scale, all that is going to make a massive difference in how many samples you actually need. So what in fact are we looking at? Well, really we got to look at the idea of a diminishing return. You know, how many samples is worth it to really make the image nice and clear? And then how many samples do we not even notice anymore? At a certain point, the image is clean and refined enough. You don't really see any kind of grain or artifacting or anything like that. So obviously I could just come in here and every render I do, it's at 16,000 samples. But you know, I might notice that about 800 samples or 500 samples or whatever the number may be, that the image is clean. And so that is the rate of diminishing return, where we can just keep throwing samples at it, but your human eye can't really pick up on what those differences are. And so for this, what I like to do is I like to start with a lower value here. So I'll start with something, you know, like 200 and come in and let's refresh my render and then watch your image. Or actually maybe even start off with something even higher. Maybe start off with, you know, 2000, right? And just watch this render, right? And you can see here the sample count and what the max is set to, and look at your image and look until you see all the kind of grain removed. And again, this is to your specific taste and your threshold of how much grain you're willing to accept in your final render. And then once you get to that spot where you're like, yeah, the clarity is pretty good, I see most of the grain is removed, then you can stop it and you can reset your sample count to just that. So I'm going to say 800. I think at 800, this image is going to be resolved enough that I don't really see any kind of noticeable grain, and it's a nice clean image. Something I'll do quite a lot of times too is I'll drop this sample count super low when I'm just trying to like previs something, or even build some sort of automatic or first pass or something like that, where I want to get the client's feedback on the lighting and the textures, but we don't really have enough time or purpose to do a full render. And so what I'll do is I'll drop this super low, even something like a sample count of like 10. As long as there's enough information there that the client can read that image and maybe give you some specifics. Yeah, this is grainy, but maybe you're just doing an animation test, so they need to see it from moving from point A to point B, and this gives them a better idea of what that final look is going to be. And you note that, hey, you know, this is not the final render, but they get a better understanding of the final project. So I really love playing with the sample count for a lot of different cases. But let's put this back up to 800 now. Now the rest of these settings, I don't really touch until after I kind of get and nail down the look that I want of my scene, because then I know where that threshold is and needs to be, and what I can tweak and what I shouldn't and leave alone. So I don't touch any of these, such as the diffuse, specular, or scattering depth, until I feel like my scene is kind of finalized. And then I come in here and say, okay, how do I optimize my render time? What can I increase? What do I need to increase? What do I need to reduce here? So I've already begun to reduce this. I think the default is 16, and you see here that I have this set at 8. And there's no real kind of visual difference or noticeable difference currently. And reducing this can greatly reduce your render times as well, but it can also kind of stop the kind of amount of light that's bouncing. And you'll notice the lower I get with this value, the darker corners, little pockets, crevices, one object being in close proximity to another object, those areas will get darker and darker. So if I bring this diffuse depth down to 1, you can see in exactly those areas, we're not getting as much light that's kind of bouncing and forming into those areas of the diffuse. And again, this might be a good way of lighting your scene and playing with it if you want it in the evening hours or dusk or something like that. But I want to fill these areas in. So let's go in and slowly increase this. Let's bring this back to 3. And what I like to do to really kind of tell the difference here between one frame or the other is I'll set up a render region here. And so if I kind of let this render out enough to where I can see the kind of the quality, and then I set up a render region, I kind of render this area, and then maybe I bring this up to something like 8 again, right? So now this area in the center where the render region is going to be the diffuse depth of 8, and everywhere else is going to be a diffuse depth of 3. And if I just begin to click and drag somewhere else, you can kind of see right there the difference between 8 and 3. You know, we get a little bit nicer color value maybe, and an overall kind of less muddiness and dirtiness to the specular. That's kind of really where I'm noticing it right now. I'm not really noticing a ton anywhere else in the bounce. And so what I can do is I can maybe find that difference and that tolerance that I think is acceptable. So maybe I make this and bring it up 1 value again. And guess what? You know, the amount of time that you put into it, I've noticed is typically worth the 5 or 10 minutes you put into the render settings that it saves you during the actual render time. So if you do this towards the end of your project and you start tweaking this, that 5 to 10 minutes of adjusting your settings to save you 30, 40 hours, you know, many minutes, many hours on your final render is well worth taking a pause and seeing how you can start refining some of this. So I'll check this one more time here. I'll set up my render region, maybe capture, you know, an area like this. And this is at 4 right now. Let's bring this to 8. And let's just resolve it. I think that's pretty close, right? I might maybe make it 5 and say, that is good. I'm happy with that. I think that is very clear and I don't need to mess with this anymore. And again, this is all dependent. None of these numbers and values that I'm giving you is like the default. Like just do this for any of your scenes. It's all dependent on the scene in which you're creating. So now let's jump over to the specular depth. In this scene, I don't really have much specular, so things like metals as well as glass. And since I don't have those, what I can do is I can really drop this rather low. As you can see, if I take that specular depth here and bring this to 1, you can see nothing in my image really changes. So that is perfect, right? And that's why I wouldn't want to come in here by default and maybe make this 1, because maybe then I'm working with glass materials at some point or some sort of specular metal material. And I'm like, wow, this really looks bad. Well, then I'd have to go back into my render settings. So I really like to keep everything at default until the end, until I see exactly where the final image is going to be, and then I begin to adjust. But the specular depth, the more it's reduced, will make your surfaces a little bit darker, less reflective and bright. And for transparent objects, it will make that specular material become less see-through, less transparent. Now, you know, something to kind of mention as well about the specular, reducing this, you know, increasing this or reducing it, as long as you don't really have any of that specular depth that's needed in here, it's not really going to play a whole lot of difference in reducing the time unless you have those materials in here. And the same goes for the scatter depth, right? Now, I do have scattering in here, and the scattering depth will be a functional system for both materials with scattering medium, a random walk, as well as octane fog or volumes of any kind. And so this scattering depth will definitely play a role in what the medium looks like here for these kind of melting figures. So if I bring this down to 1, you know, you'll see kind of a pretty obvious difference here. Let me readjust my render region, and let's bring this scattering depth back up to 8. And you'll kind of notice a pretty clear line here where we have this render region where it's at 8 and the other, right? See how muddy and dark that kind of scattering medium looks on that edge, as opposed to where we have it kind of refined a little bit more. And so this is definitely something that, you know, I might want to play with and increase a little bit. 1 seems a bit too low, but maybe the scattering again at something like 5 will be fairly nice. So I can kind of come in here and see overall what that blend is going to be. And look at that, even at 5, I think that is a pretty solid value here, where I don't see much difference between 8 and 5. And so perfect. I know I can keep that a bit lower as well. And so you just have to take a look at what is worth, the extra render time. If it's an animation and something's playing through, you might be able to get away with a little bit less. If it's a still, it's worth probably cranking some of the settings up. All right, the next setting we're going to look at is the GI clamp, and GI stands for global illumination. So this is going to be looking at the global illumination and bounce light through our whole entire scene. Now the default is set to 1,000,000. You definitely don't have to keep it at 1,000,000. This is an area that we can really kind of reduce. And sometimes you might find that you get a lot of artifacting and more artifacting when it's at 1,000,000 as opposed to maybe something like 1. Now you'll see here from 1,000,000 to 1, I see no visual difference between these two. I think a good rule is to jump in here and make this 16. The only reason you'll see some artifacting or additional issues the lower you get here, like something like 1, is if you have an area or a material that requires some additional scattering. So any kind of material or scene setup that requires a lot of secondary light bounces, those can start to begin to suffer the lower you get this. But you'll notice that the difference between something like 8 and something like 16, even for those, there's probably no difference or a very marginal difference at that. And so I think a good set is 16. And if you just always want to play it safe, 32. 32 is a really good area for the GI clamp that is going to solve 99% of your issues here with GI clamp, and again reduce a lot of artifacting throughout the rest of the scene. So bring this down unless you're doing something very specialized that has a lot of secondary light bounces. Now in this scene, this kind of sums up where we're going to take this. We'll jump back into Octane render settings in a moment, but now what we want to do is we want to focus on some other areas that you can use to help speed up your workflow and performance. And if I look at this too, actually, let's jump back right into the render settings before I go too far. Now that we've tweaked some of those settings, this is fairly clean well before it gets to 800 samples. So I can actually drop this down. Let's bring this down now to 500. And so because of all these additional tweaks here, I think this looks really nice and refined by the time we only get to 500 samples. So the speed and performance is kind of getting quicker over time. Now, if we jump into our Octane Camera and we go into the camera imager, this is always great to enable this because I can basically do almost all my color correction just in the Octane Camera, all inside of Octane anymore. And that's really what I do. If you're on a PC, the Specular AI denoiser is unbelievable. Really, really fantastic. Enable that and you can get your render times down yet again. So if I refresh this render here, you'll notice that we've got a couple tabs here at the bottom. Now, the Specular AI denoiser is a post effect, so you're not going to be able to see it until the render hits whatever max sample count you have. And there's two tabs at the bottom, one that says main, one that says denoise main. And that will show you what it looks like with or without that setting there. So if I actually zoom in here, make it a little bit easier on everyone to see what the difference is between the final render without the noise and what it looks like denoise. So this is, almost 3 times zoomed in here. Let's just wait for this to render to 500 and then I can show you the difference before and after. All right, so now that that's complete, you can toggle back and forth and see what it looks like with the denoised and the main render. So I actually might be able to get away with even lower sample settings. So let's go back in to our Octane render settings and I'll change this to maybe 200 samples. And now if we refresh this render here, obviously it's going to be even grainier, but because we're using a Specular AI denoiser, it's going to clean it up in the end. Now you have to make sure that you just don't drop it super low and hope that the Specular AI denoiser is going to solve all your problems, especially in an animation. In a still, you can get away with a lot lower samples and have it clean, but come animation time, you can get a lot of splotchiness. And And I don't know if you can see it, but I can see here a little bit of splotchiness. You do need enough samples in your render for the AI spectral denoiser to actually do its thing. It needs to know the actual color value of pixels, needs to know the actual edge of the location of a pixel to really make the best final resolution. So it's not just like you can just drop your samples down to an insane value here and everything's going to be fine. You definitely want to make sure that you begin to clean up those little areas, throw enough samples in. So there is kind of a threshold that you have to play with if you're doing an animation. If it's just a still, like I said, you can get away with significantly less samples and it's still going to look fine. Now there's one other note that when you use the spectral AI denoiser is to come in here and check and enable static noise. Now, typically static noise looks really weird within animations, but you'll get less splotchiness and jumping around of that splotchiness during an animation if you check on static noise. And then in post and compositing, I always like to have a little bit of noise. So what I'll do is I'll go in and throw a little noise or grain in there, and that solves any of that static noise that we had from our animation. Now let's go back into our Octane Camera. Now I don't have any hot pixels or fireflies in this render, but I've had them in many renders before. And if we come down here into our camera settings, in our camera imager settings specifically, and you look at the hot pixel removal, this is now an area that we want to look at. And it's by default at 1. And so as you begin to reduce this, it will slowly remove any of those kind of hot pixels or fireflies, which are pixels that are just not quite getting refined yet. And by lowering this value, it will start to remove those. And you'll see that in real time, the removal of those. Now, if you just bring this down to 0, that will obviously remove as many hot pixels as possible. But what will happen is a lot of the detail will start to get a little bit soft. And this is totally fine if you're doing something that's a little bit more stylized. Even like this render would be kind of fine. I do notice some of like that I've got like this flake that's going on in these cube materials here. That do lose a little bit of quality depending on where I put this and place this hot pixel removal. But for the most part, that's going to stay there. So out of a lot of different testing that I've done, if I'm doing something that's more photorealistic, I've found that I can bring this to about 0.45, 0.46 and not experience any real loss of granular level detail. If I begin to go much more below this, I do start noticing a little bit too much softness in that granular level detail. So this is kind of, again, a threshold that you have to play with depending on your image. This is what I found that works really well for me and kind of that threshold, that personal threshold that I have for removing enough hot pixels, but at the same time, keeping that detail that I need within textures as well as, you know, edges of objects and that sharpness. Now, let's go back to that spectral AI denoiser. So we did get it working here in the live viewer, but if you want to actually render that out, what you need to do is you need to go into your actual render settings here inside of Cinema 4D and go into the Octane render, and you have to enable used denoise beauty pass. And so once you check that on, it will actually render the denoised beauty within your frames. If you don't, that effect will not be applied at all to your final image sequence. Now, while we're in here, I'll go over a couple little extra things. You know, as far as your output, always remember that inside of Cinema 4D that you've got your frame rate that you can render from your render settings, as well as your frame rate that you can keyframe at in your project. So just make sure they match if that's exactly what you want, if you want to export at the same frame rate that you've keyframed at. And then in our save setting, take a look at the format. I really recommend always using the OpenEXR format at 32-bit depth. Now, I've seen some really awesome tests where artists have shown that PNGs can actually take a little bit longer. If you use anything other than OpenEXR, I would recommend PNG. And this is for a digital format. Obviously, print will be something different. But the PNG sequences can take a lot longer to render than the EXR and can actually end up being a heavier file. And then the 32-bit channel is going to give you so much more flexibility in post if you need to adjust some of the exposure and levels of your image, as well as shift any of the colors of your image as well. It's going to give you a greater variation in those without either blowing out your image and overexposing it or everything becoming super dark, as well as giving you more color value information to adjust later on if you need. And that's it. That sums up the best ways of optimizing your render. We went from 1,000 to 200 samples here. Again, if I'm going to animate this, I'd probably throw maybe 400 samples in just to reduce any possibility of some splotchiness or chattering within the animation. But hey, why don't you just render, 5-10 frames and do a test and make sure that it's at the quality that you want for an animation. Animation is always worth testing out. And if it's a still, then you can get away with a lot less. So I hope that helps you and saves you a ton of time on your next renders.